Hi, my name is Nahid Siamdoust. I'm an assistant professor of media and Middle Eastern studies, and this is the Music and Uprisings office hours. So nearly all of the uprisings in the Middle East over the last 2 decades or so, and in Iran, which is my area of specialization, music has played an important role spanning not just the 2 decades, but over a century long, for example. As far as my own expertise goes in Iran, Iranians have been demanding independence, freedom, and justice for over a century, starting with the constitutional revolution of 1906, 1911, onward to 1979, and then the Green Uprising of 2009, and the Women Life Freedom Uprising of 2022. And all across that sort of, more than 100 years arc of freedom struggle, music has been a very important element in the kinds of demands that people have made, as well as bringing people together and uniting them in their quest. As far as other countries are concerned, certainly we saw the important role of music in the Arab uprisings and revolutions starting with 2011. So starting with Tunisia, music was very important, from Kelmti Horra, My Word is Freedom, by a Tunisian singer who was a young woman who was sitting in the crowd and started voicing that quest for freedom, and has since gone on to have a very distinguished musical career, to El General, the rapper who asked the Tunisian dictator to step down. This was also the case in Syria, of protesters coming together to call on the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad to step down. There, Abdul Bassem al-Sarut actually was a very important musician who sang of Jannah, Jannah, Heaven, Heaven, and another musician, Ghashoush, who asked for the dictator to step down. And, all across the Middle East, the Gezi protests in Turkey, for example, their music was also very important. One of the very well-known songs in the square was the song of Pans and Pots, where the musicians basically just sat around and did this form of protest that is well known to Turkish people, just, hitting on pots and pans and demanding for a better life, ultimately. And of course, in Sudan, a country with a very rich musical history, there too, music played an important role in the protests. And there, of course, as in several other of these places, of these countries, women played a central role in both creating the music and voicing the protest. What does music have to do with uprisings? At the end of the day, we as humans live a very fragile existence, and a quite peculiar sort of existence, right? So much of our life is rooted in materiality of things, and livelihood, and eating, and working, and affording a life. But a good portion of it is really sort of in the realm of the metaphysical, right? Of creating meaning and having a meaning in life, and a sense of community and belonging, and all of that. And music really fuels that aspect of our lives. Of course, it also fuels the sort of materialist aspect of our lives in many ways when we think about pop music or the music industry and all of that. But music has been so important in these uprisings in really providing that story that connects people in a certain temporal or regional space, in certain countries, across different governments and different eras, in rooting them to the kind of language and to the stories that they have crafted and woven over the decades of what matters to them as a people. And music can express sentiments in a way that other forms of culture production really can't. It's also accessible in a way that others aren't. So music has just been important in uniting people, perfect strangers, over certain discourse. Emil Durkheim has a term for that: collective effervescence, where people can come together and all of a sudden have this feeling of uniting over certain sentiments. Or Michael Warner, for example, talks about discourses that are able to unite perfect strangers into a public. Music has that fine-tuned quality that allows for that, not only in its lyrics and in its sentiments, but also in the way in which music can be interpreted in a range of ways, right? It has that openness or that possibility for ambiguity, so that people very much can interpret themselves into music and come away with potentially slightly different interpretations, but at the end of the day, the quests are the same. So, I don't think you could imagine musical uprisings across the Middle East without music. If you look at Western media, you would think that the genre of protest across the Middle East is hip hop. That's because, Western media loves to see sort of Middle Eastern hip hop. And there's truth to that. Hip hop has been very important. Certainly, Rap Farsi has been very important to protest music in Iran. It has been important in Tunisia. It has been important in Turkey, in Palestine, in Egypt. But for the most part, the kind of music that is able to really unite people happens to go back to sort of nationalist, revolutionary songs that have existed for decades, folk music that has existed for decades, that people know very well. So I would say as much as rap and hip hop do play an important role, if we want to think of a genre that really is important across the board in these countries, we'd have to sort of name it something like a folk / national / revolutionary repertoire that is known to peoples across the region. Yeah, was music really banned? It seems just inconceivable that, a country would, sort of a revolution would happen, new government would come in that would ban music altogether. The reality of it is that, the supreme, back then he wasn't the supreme leader yet, but the revolutionary leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, did come in and say, music is like opium and it corrupts the minds of the youth and it needs to be banned completely. He said, if you want your youth to be righteous and to pursue the good things in life and not to go after all the sort of, vapid, superficial things like Western youth do, then you should ban music. But ultimately, Khomeini himself came around very quickly because not long after the revolution succeeded, one of his dearest proteges, Mortaza Motahhari, was assassinated. And some people from within, some revolutionaries, sort of committed artists from within state television, they created this song for Motahhari and brought it to Khomeini himself. And this song, interestingly, actually, even though it had these elements of march and revolutionary music, which even up to that point were still kind of okay. Anything that didn't include instrumentals was still viewed to be okay. But they brought it to Khomeini and he listened to it and he said, I don't cry much, but I cried when I heard this song. This kind of music is permitted. This is okay. So, what's fascinating is that even with this tough revolutionary father of Iran at the time, who instantly had said music is corrupt and should be banned, when he heard a song that he perceived to be committed to the revolution and in commemoration of one of his beloved proteges, his mind changed. He said, no, this is okay. And so from that point onward, he allowed for certain kinds of music, revolutionary music, committed music to be produced in state television for the purposes of the revolution. And so for a couple of years, music had a bit of a unstable status. But I would say not long after, within a couple of years, state television, state radio itself was producing volumes of music. However, the kinds of music that could be produced were very much restricted and continue to be restricted more than 45 years after the revolution. Okay, so that question, asks about a very sort of new era of music making, right? We're talking about Spotify, we're talking about social media and new media technologies. And that really applies to about the last 20 years of music making in the world, right? A little bit more than 20 years, perhaps, in the West. We can definitely say that social media and new media changed the way in which music could be made and spread. And this certainly affected the volumes of music that were made by underground musicians, both in Iran and the rest of the Middle East, in getting their music out there. But that's not to say that, this couldn't be done prior to new media. So Prior to new media, small media still existed. What we mean by small media is, not the big media such as state television, satellite television, and so on, but cassette tapes. Cassette tapes were small media. These were tapes that anybody could record and spread quite easily. In fact, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 owes a great debt to this very small medium of the cassette tape, whereby Khomeini's sermons were copied on hundreds of cassette tapes from his seat in France, Neuf-le-Château in France, and brought into, sort of recorded over the telephone onto tapes in Iran and then multiplied there and spread among the population. So prior to new media, we had that, and musicians would record and spread at great risk to their own personal safety and security in most of these contexts. And certainly with new media, that risk still exists, but musicians have taken great advantage of the affordances of new media and things like Spotify to spread their music. I think it's worth saying that another thing that new media have facilitated is for the diaspora, because a lot of these Middle Eastern countries have huge diasporas because of the tumultuous decades which all of them have at this point experienced over the last 4 decades or more. There are huge diasporas of all of these countries around the world, in Europe and the US and further east in Asia. And so new media has also allowed them to partake in music making for dissent and protest in their home countries. They've been able to contribute to protest music within these countries. Absolutely. New protest songs oftentimes actually have roots in older songs or that are recycled for the new movement. In fact, that's how they create cohesion with, both finding resonance with among people, because these are songs that people know and can recite and sing along with. And also because these are songs that sort of bind people together in their collective memory of a past during which they also had certain political and social demands. And so, when we think about my own area of expertise, of course, Iran, there's so many songs that are recycled. One of them in particular, Az Khune Javanan Lale Damide, which means from the blood of the youth, tulips have grown, goes back to more than a century, to the constitutional era. It really is a song that has resurfaced again and again. During 1979, it has been resung by so many famous musicians. And, this exists also in other contexts. For example, in Egypt, during the 2011 Arab Uprising, the Egyptian Revolution, there were songs that were coming, by El Tambura from the nationalization of the Suez Canal in Port Said that were really resung. And these were songs that people could really engage with. And so the recycling of songs is kind of a recurrent feature of music and uprisings in the Middle East. So fun to say Googoosh. She is sort of a daughter of Iran. That's really who she is, because Iranians have known her since the age of 3. She was already a prolific performer as a child, and prior to the revolution, when there were no restrictions on women singing music, Googoosh was the country's biggest pop star, and everybody sort of followed her every move. When Googoosh got a haircut, all Iranian young women went and copied her haircut. That's how beloved she was. When the revolution happened, the Islamic Republic that took power decided that women were no longer allowed to sing. And so a lot of very accomplished female musicians who were very much part of Iranian households, they were silenced, and Googoosh was one of them. The majority decided to leave the country. So they left for Europe or the US. Many of them set up their new homes in Los Angeles, which ultimately became known with time as Tehrangeles, because that's where a lot of these musicians went and, created music studios and continued to produce music that was consumed both by Iranians in the diaspora, but especially by Iranians inside Iran itself, again, through the use of these small media that we talked about, cassette tapes and VHS tapes. Googoosh, however, decided to stay. She was among a number of musicians at the time who had some political inclinations. They opposed the kind of dictatorship that the Shah and the human rights violations that the Shah also practiced during his reign. When we look back at the revolution now, we think that at the time everybody must have conceived it as being something horrible, but that is not really true as far as the historiography of that particular event is concerned. This was a very hopeful revolution, and people really had great sort of expectations of the kind of liberatory forces that would be unleashed and the kind of democratic system that would exist. Within short order, it was clear that that was not going to be the case. But somebody like Googoosh, she stayed and she thought, let me see if this is going to evolve. And also, for the first 10 years or so of the Islamic Republic, people kept thinking, this will be over soon. There's no way such a strict, religious government is going to be taking over this country, and this system will fall very soon. And so people kind of waited it out, and Googoosh was one of those people. Unfortunately, however, she became travel banned, and so she couldn't leave the country for about 20 years because of the significance and the importance that she sort of held within her as a cultural icon and as an artist. The state was pretty nervous about her being able to leave or, make even a simple statement because of her popularity. And so for 20 years, Googoosh was silenced. Lucky for her and for Iranians at large, she happened to have come to fame at such a young age that by the year 2000, when she finally managed to get a permit to leave the country and give concerts around the world, her first one being in Canada, she was still young. She was about 50. And when she gave her very first concert in 2001, I believe, in Toronto, she got a 10-minute long standing ovation. And, this is with the entire audience. It actually brings tears to my eyes right now, too. Just having tears in their eyes at this incredible historical moment of their beloved musician being allowed to stand on a stage and sing to them again. Yes, it has been dangerous. There have been musicians who have received the death sentence, although no musician that I know of has actually, in Iran at least, paid the price of paid the price with their life. The most recent example that we have of that is Toomaj Salehi, the rapper in Iran who became very popular throughout the course of Iran's Women Life Freedom Uprising. He was sentenced to death and only recently had his sentence revoked and made it out. In Syria, if we think about it, Basit al-Sarut, he ended up being, his songs are very much intoned these days, given the fall of the Assad regime. And he ended up becoming really the voice of protest in Syria, but then joining the rebel forces against the Assad regime. And he was a very talented and accomplished goalkeeper, actually. In another world, in another day, he may have made it from the Syrian national team to the better team, sort of, Egyptian or Jordanian or Emirati and onto the European League, perhaps. But given the particulars of his political context, he joined the rebel forces and ultimately died in fighting Assad. And there was also a story of Ghashoush, the other protest singer, having his throat cut and his vocal cords pulled out. There's some lack of clarity around his story, because then a few years later, some story surfaced that he was indeed alive. But that just goes to show, the risk that musicians take on for voicing protest. Another very sort of prominent example, because music has been so prolific and so important in the Iranian context in particular, is Mohammad Reza Shajarian, Iran's preeminent vocalist of Persian classical music, who wasn't incarcerated. He was way too popular for the regime to be able to do that to him, but who became effectively banned from singing and giving concerts and leaving the country. So if musicians don't pay with their lives, certainly they pay a great cost in other ways, whether it's their livelihoods, their music. Many musicians in Iran, people would argue, have died simply of depression, of not being able to pursue the thing that gave meaning to their lives. And so yes, musicians have paid a high cost for, giving us the stories and the stuff that really unites us and unites people across the Middle East. forget Rihanna. I mean, there are like dozens of vocalists in Iran, women, female vocalists that will sing her under the table. Even though, and that is true, yes, the solo female voice is still banned in Iran today. More than 45 years after the revolution, women can still not officially sing in Iran solo. They can sing in choirs, they can sing bivocally, but their single voice can't be heard out. And yet, Iranian musicians, women musicians have been so hard at work training their voices, taking lessons, working hard to become very accomplished vocalists. And so if you open Iranian social media, any day of the week, you will see dozens of songs beautifully intoned by women musicians. So, there's this real split between what the government still institutes as the permissible and the real life of Iranians, which takes place on all kinds of registers where the government really can't have as much control as it can in, let's say, public music halls or the streets or schools or, state television. So in private spaces, in unofficial concerts, on social media, or, the most recent performance of this entire concert by Parastu Ahmadi that was spread through social media and really went viral. Iranian women have been very active vocalists, even though their voices remain to be banned by the state. So Iran's Women Life Freedom Uprising of 2022 was ignited by the death in morality police custody of Mahsa Jina Amini, a 22-year-old woman who was visiting family in Tehran with her family from the Kurdish town of Saqqez. And she was apprehended by the morality police and died a few days later in hospital of a brain seizure. The circumstances of her death have still not been fully investigated. What we do know is that she died in custody. So Iranians rose up, but Iranians were infuriated that something so simple as a few strands of hair showing should lead to the death of such a young life. And because this young life happened to be the life of a woman, a life of a Kurdish woman from the margins, it ignited this national uprising that was truly intersectional. People from all strands of life, they all united to really protest this Islamic regime that restricts certain things that have become, so banal to Iranians at this day and age. Choosing how you present in life, what you wear, how you comport yourself in public, what you do with your life. People rose up to say enough is enough. And this really ignited a movement that demanded regime change, that no longer asked for reforms to happen, but asked for a, straight up just downfall of this regime and a change of the governmental system. And music, once again, was very important in fueling the sentiments of this uprising. To begin with, Shervin Hajipour's Baraye, which translates to for the sake of, became a so-called anthem of the uprising. What he did was he collected Twitter hashtags to the hashtag Baraye, for the sake of, and composed a song, the lyrics of his song from these tweets. And so, for dancing in the rain, for a simple smile, for the, street children, for Piruz, the cheetah who's at risk of extinction, basically talking about all these fronts on which the government is failing, whether it's the protection of the environment, the protection of animals, the protection of Iran's resources, the protection and welfare of Iranian people, of its youth, of a sort of, simple, ordinary life. I mentioned Baraye, but a lot of the music actually was both produced and voiced by women. A lot of old songs, we talked about recycling old songs, old sort of third worldist, liberationist songs from the Latin American context were taken. These were songs that were highly popular in 1970s Iran leading up to the 1979 revolution. Taking these songs that a lot of Iranians know, such as Un Pueblo Unido from the Chilean protest movement, and re-voicing them, changing the lyrics to speak to the realities of Iranian women and to the current moment, or Bella Ciao, which is an old sort of anti-fascist Italian song. Other songs, as Khune Javanan from the Blood of Martyrs, The Tulips Have Grown, really taking a lot of these songs, but also creating a lot of new songs to speak to this moment. The Woman Life Freedom Movement, because it was such a movement rooted in life, in sort of connecting, the creative force of life and the creative force of the arts, was explosive as far as, music was concerned, and probably created the largest volume of songs of any protest movement in modern Iran, spanning more than a century. Love Olivia Rodrigo, but sorry, failed. That does not count as music scholarship, but it might count as research. If you listen closely, depends on what kind of listening you're doing, right? If you're just kind of have it in the background, or if you're actually sort of paying attention to the kinds of semantic relations that she constructs between certain words in her lyrics, or the tonality that she uses. Music scholarship really comes together in considering the political, social, cultural context of the music and how that music creates the kinds of political demands or the kinds of public formation that we talked about, what role it plays in the political and social developments in a certain time and place in a given context. So it has so much to do with the context, the maker, the rules and regulations and the norms and the conventions and the kind of reception that music might have among its listeners. But I would say starting with doing close listening, that's a good start for music scholarship. You won't, those hours won't be completely wasted. Well, thanks for watching. This has been the Music and Uprisings Office Hour, and I really hope to see you in one of my classes, studying the intersection of politics and culture in the Middle East.